So, our next speaker is Antoine Levy, and he will speak on restoration of the Ecclesia ex Circumcisione. Welcome.
My paper has one point in common with that of Etienne Veteux. It has been trimmed for the to fit into the terrifying time slot. But the similarities between my presentation and the presentation of Etienne Veteux stop here. Okay? And also I made an important correction. I made a mistake and I corrected it. So don't rely on what is written in your thing. Yeah. What a difference a question mark makes. I was asked to speak about the restoration of the Ecclesia ex Circumcisione, and my only request was to put a question mark at the end of the title of my presentation. Indeed, it's far from granted that this formulation makes sense. In order to speak about restoring an entity, one must not only be sure that one knows about what entity one is talking, one needs to be certain that such an entity has existed at some point in time. As is common knowledge, one finds the expression Ecclesia ex Circumcisione on an early 5th century mosaic of the Basilica di Santa Sabina in Rome. It is personified as a veiled woman with a book in her hand, a representation that is symmetrically contrasted with that of another woman holding a book and wearing the insignia of a Roman matron. And the latter is characterized as the Ecclesia ex Gentibus. Both figures are parts of a dedicatory inscription that commemorates a priest by the name of Peter of Illyria, the founder of Santa Sabina. Obviously, the two ecclesia evoke the two sources out of which the one Church of Christ was born. Still, this is a composition of 5th century sacred art. Accordingly, one is entitled to ask whether this late antiquity artistic representation truly talks about some original, albeit lost, ecclesial entity that would need to be restored in order for the Church to be faithful to her identity and vocation. And in my opinion, conceptual as well as historical precision are of the essence here. And I would like to begin the considerations that follow by listing a few meanings of the word restoration, keeping in mind the biblical references with which these meanings correlate, and I will then scrutinize the historical substrate of the Ecclesia ex Circumcisione, and finally, I will endeavor to bring forward new reading of the message conveyed by the mosaic of Santa Sabina. Using the Oxford English Dictionary as my instruments of reference, I'm inclined to ascribe three main meanings to the notion of restoration. So let me shortly review them. The first is the one that comes to mind whenever we hear a syntax for the restoration of the Ecclesia ex Circumcisione. I quote the Oxford Dictionary: the action of restoring a person to a former state or position, the fact of being restored or reinstated, and the meaning can be said to encompass that of returning something that has been stolen or lost. In the Hebrew Bible, both actions are expressed by the same crucial verb, lehashiv. God who leads the nation back to the land promised to Abraham. Jeremiah 16, one reads, for instance, the Lord lives who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north, from all the countries where I banished them, for I will restore them to their own land, ve'ashivotim al adamatam, reduka meos in teram suam, in Genesis chapter 5. When God speaks here in a dream to Abimelech, the king of Gerar, who took the wife of Abraham, he says, now therefore restores the man's wife, for he's a prophet. What we have in mind is a concrete point in space and time to which we want to go back. And in the language that we speak, this point can be identified with a specific, for instance, specific social order. To read in the dictionary, the restoration as a self-explanatory substantive has come to designate the re-establishment of the monarchy in England, the return of Charles II in 1660, or in France, the Bourbons in 1814. the Protestant world developed a similar pattern with the doctrinal constellation that goes by the name of Restorationism. Classical Reformation is satisfied with putting the church back on her feet, which it identified with sound Christian faith. Meanwhile, Restorationism, as a spiritual posture that can be found among early Anabaptists and in different forms among Pentecostals and Mormons, brings forward the original apostolic church as an ecclesiological model and ideal. In order to remedy the current state of degradation of the church, true Christians should strive to rediscover the first apostolic community and imitate its way of life. The second meaning of restoration that one finds in the dictionary has to do with medical art, first in a technical sense and then in a much wider one. The reduction of a fracture, dislocation, anatomical restoration, and the action of restoring a person to health, consciousness, recovery of physical strength. And here there's a complete change of semantic register in the Hebrew Bible, probably because the action is no longer about going back to the present, from the present to a point in the past, but about a point in the past somehow resurfacing in the present context. Be that as it may, it is a substantive arucha that expresses this meaning in Hebrew. In Jeremiah chapter 17, one reads, "For I will restore you to health, ki a'ala arucha lach, obdu kamenim cicatricem tibi, and I will heal you of your wounds." One finds the very same semantic register in the passages of the New Testament that tell about Jesus' miraculous healings. For instance, when Jesus heals a man with the desiccated hand in Mark 3:5, one reads, he says, "Stretch out your hand," and he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Apokatestati hiraftu, restituta es manus illi. I will come back on the Greek verb that is used here, apokatistemi, literally to establish or ordain back again. I would associate another, so to speak, technical meaning of restoration with this second meaning. Here the use of the word restoration simply shifts from the field of medical science to that of architectural engineering. As a physician restores organ to health, likewise a builder restores houses or walls that were damaged. The dictionary speaks of the action of building up again or reconstructing, the process of carrying out alterations and repairs and something into its original form. In the Hebrew Bible, it is the same substantive, arucha, that renders this meaning of restoration. It immediately evokes the restoration of the temple after the deportation to Babylon. In the second book of Chronicles, chapter 24, verse 13, one reads, "The workman labored and the repair work progressed in their hands. Ta'al arucha lemelacha beyadam, obdut shebatur parietum cicatrix per manus eorum," and they restore the house of God according to its specifications and strengthen it. The same formula is applied to the renovation of Jerusalem's walls. In the book of Nehemiah, we read that the Persian officials became incensed when they heard that the breaches of the wall had been restored. Ki alta arucha lechomot Yerushalayim kot obdukta eset cicatrix muri Jerusalem. This understanding of restoration as the action of repairing the damages inflicted to the temple or the walls of the city finds a remarkable echo in the Jewish tradition, most especially in the Luriani Kabbalah. I have in mind the notions of tikkun olam, the task of repairing the cracks that followed God's original act of creation. One could say that tikkun olam is the principle that grants meaning and purpose to the whole sphere of mitzvot, to religious observances within Judaism. And we finally come to the third main meaning of a restoration. The dictionary speaks rather vaguely of the action of bringing back in existence, the restitution, the renewal. The truth is that no definition can easily capture this meaning of the word restoration. Its use refers to the notion that we mentioned earlier, that of apokatastasis. For the Stoics, apokatastasis would designate a radical new beginning of things after a general conflagration in an endless series of cosmic cycles. leaving aside this pre-Nietzschean concept of eternal return, one comes across this very same notion, that of radical new beginning in the New Testament. In Matthew chapter 17, 11, Jesus declared Elijah is coming and will restore all things. Elias men erchete proton kapokatastasis panta. And further, in the Acts of the Apostles, apokatastasis is clearly identified with the end of history. Peter urges his fellow Jews to repent so that God might, I quote, send Jesus the Christ appointed for you, whom heaven must receive until the period of restoration of all things, achichron apokatastasios panton, about which God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from ancient time. As is well known, apokatastasis, as a specific teaching regarding the end of time, was later associated with Origen's alleged views on universal salvation, including the salvation of demons, a doctrine formally condemned at the Second Council of Constantinople in 553. Now that we have more or less sorted out the three main meanings of restoration, we can examine which, if any, of these meanings could or should be associated with the notion of Ecclesia ex Circumcisione. What we need to do is first to investigate the configuration of the church in the apostolic times. Salvation, my second point, salvation is from the Jews, ecclesiological implications. Before assigning any theological significance to the fact that the church was founded by a Jew and his Jewish disciples, one must underscore that it is a historical fact, just as the involvement of a relatively great number of so-called Jews in the first communities of disciples of Jesus. The question that we are asking here is whether these facts justify speaking of the early existence of an Ecclesia ex Circumcisione. We already know that if she ever existed, this Ecclesia could never have been identical to the one and only true church. Of course, besides, before the decision of welcoming Gentiles on a par with Jews taken at the Council of Jerusalem, Acts 15, the disciples were Jews, and these Jews formed the one and only church. However, these Jews formed the one and only church because they were disciples of Jesus, or because they were Jews. Now, the first assumption is correct. It becomes clear with the decision taken at the Council of Jerusalem. According to this decision, the criterion for membership in the one and true church was referred to discipleship through faith, in contrast to ethnicity. Still, did the Jewish disciple within this one and true church ever form a sub-entity that one could call an Ecclesia ex Circumcisione, just as we speak today of a Latin church, a Melkite church within the Catholic Church? The original community of disciples in Jerusalem, the one associated with the leadership of James, the brother of Jesus, has often been viewed as the proto-archetype of the Ecclesia ex Circumcisione. Undoubtedly, this community has had a very special status in the early church. The pillars of the church were established there. And as Paul recalls in his epistle to the Galatians, however, there was something more than the seniority associated with the group of the apostles. It's certainly not a coincidence if the apostles were Jews, and if the community of James was established in Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem bore witness to the roots of the whole church. That is, to the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham, and therefore to the living legacy of the history of Israel. The inclusion of Gentiles in the church could only strengthen the calling of James' community to serve as an authorized intermediary between the message of salvation conveyed to the four corners of the world and the millennial Jewish womb out of which this message was born. That the community of James found itself connected to the ongoing life of the Jewish nation in spite of the gap created by the increasingly massive rejection of Jesus' messiahship among the latter is sufficiently well attested. Ethnically, the community must have remained overwhelmingly Jewish due to the composition of the local population. And this is also true religiously. The Acts tell us about the frequentation of the temple by the disciple. And Agesippus portrays James as a thoroughly Torah-observant Jew. Yet did these ethnic and religious ties to the Jewish nation make of the community of James a church in the church, an ecclesial entity that would be by nature distinct from all other ecclesial entity within the universal church? Nowadays, so-called Ecclesia sui juris base their membership on the adoption of a definite set of customs, rites, and practices. However, what makes an Ecclesia Circumcisione, what makes a church Jewish, as it were, could never be anything else than Jewishness itself, or the divine election of a specific nation among all the nations of the earth. Now, on what grounds could the very church community that had seen the proclamation of the decisive equality of Jewish and Gentile disciples of Christ have prevented Gentile disciples from joining it? Jewishness, criterion. Or how could it have asked these Gentiles to convert to Judaism after affirming that they were part of the church as Gentiles? Whatever be the percentage of Jews in the Jerusalem community, the formal acceptance of Gentile members qua Gentiles would ipso facto have turned it into a standard local segment of the universal church, what would later be called a diocese, which it probably did. Personally, I do not believe in the structural otherness of the Church of James, an otherness within the universal church that would have been the flip side of an almost seamless continuity with the religious institutions of Israel. True, James happened to be a so-called brother of Christ, but this would have hardly made him a priest in the Jewish sense of the term, since Jesus was not a Cohen himself. A metathesis, to quote the epistle to the Hebrews 7:12, a radical shift affecting the very nature of priesthood must have taken place in the community of James. It's not a coincidence that the same Torah-observant James depicted by Agesippus ended up stoned by his fellow Jews. The community of James might have been at the center of the Christian world in the early days of the church, but it has always been at the extreme periphery of Jewish religious orthodoxy. It's not difficult to synthesize the conundrum with which the early church wrestled. While there was a general awareness of the significance of an ongoing Jewish presence that would preserve the connection of the church with the legacy of Israel, the concrete preservation of this Jewish presence would have entailed some degree of separation between Jews and non-Jews, something that the authorities deemed incompatible with the unity of the whole body of Christ championed by Paul, the great mystery, according I quote, with which the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body, Ephesians 3:6. The impossibility of solving this conundrum led to the disintegration, we spoke abundantly, of a living Jewish presence in the church in the span of a few generations. Jewish disciples being unable to preserve a distinct mode of life and being encouraged to blend into an ever-growing community of Gentile disciples, this disintegration was but a predictable outcome of the leadership's enduring policy. Accordingly, it is clear to me, at least, that the renovation of the Ecclesia Circumcisione cannot be understood in the first sense of the term renovation, namely the action of restoring a person to a former state or position. A Jewish Messianic restorationism in the line of Anabaptist or Mormon restorationism does not make sense, either historically or theologically. At no point in the past, not even at the very beginning of the church, has there been an autonomous Ecclesia Circumcisione that was formally and institutionally defined, either in terms of space-time practice or laws. It does not make sense to accuse the church of having forgotten an entity that never existed, no more than it does to advocate the re-establishment of a type of community that never crystallized into a church because it was doomed to disintegrate from the start. That for Etienne Witte. Now, if the first meaning of restoration found in the dictionary does not apply to the quest of an Ecclesia Circumcisione, can any of the other meanings that were listed earlier make more theological sense? I believe so, and I would like to show this by bringing forward a new reading of the Mosaic of Santa Sabina, Apocatastasis in Santa Sabina, after some water. Yeah. The suspense. In a luminous article, Frederick Schlatter, praise be given to a Jesuit by a Dominican, showed that the theme illustrated on the wall of Santa Sabina can hardly have more than one origin. Actually, his article mainly deals with another mosaic, the one that is preserved in the apse of Santa Pudenziana, a mosaic that is about 10 to 20 years older than the one in Santa Sabina. The theme of the two mosaics is identical, although the inscription below the two feminine figures of Santa Sabina is missing in Santa Pudenziana. In the other basilica, two women symmetrically standing on either side of Christ are holding laurels above the heads of the apostles, and one immediately identifies the allegories of the two churches, the one originating from the synagogue and the other from the Gentile world. According to Schlatter, the theme was something of a novelty at the time. It does not follow any established iconographic tradition, nor even any notable patristic line of interpretation. Nevertheless, Schlatter finds the theme repeatedly developed in the commentaries of Saint Jerome on the prophets, commentaries that had been circulating in Rome not long before the building of Santa Pudenziana and the creation of its mosaics. For Jerome, the Church of Christ, meaning the present one, in contrast to her ancient prototype that he associates with the untainted faith of the old Israel, stems from two sources, that of the synagogue and that of gentility. He often, sometimes acrobatically, sees these two types of churches allegorically represented by couples of biblical women, for instance, the two women at the judgment of Solomon, or the prostitute and the adulteress that the prophet Hosea is asked by God to marry. Following Schlatter's insight, I believe, I'm not very modest, but I believe I found the one and only passage of Jerome's commentaries not mentioned in his article where the notions of Ecclesia ex Circumcisione and Ecclesia ex Gentibus are explicitly acknowledged and contrasted with each other. In this passage, Jerome comments on the incipit of the book of Haggai, where the prophet tells that in the second year of Darius the king, on the first day of the 6th month, the exile to Babylon got news that the time to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem had come. Jerome delves into the symbolism of numbers. 6 months of Darius' reign stand for the 6th day of God's creation, while the second year stands for the number 2, symbolizing the restoration, reparatio of the world, as well as the generation of an offspring by two parents, materia mundi duplicem numerum diligit, the matter of which the world is made, likes the number 2, end of quotation. What Jerome wants to emphasize is that the timing of the rebuilding of the temple under Darius says something about the final restoration, the reparatio, at the end of times, of the world as we know it, with its succession of generations. This cosmic reparatio must take place right before the parousia, which Jerome implicitly identifies with the 7th day of creation. Further, playing with number 2 and the number 12, Jerome contemplates the manner in which the Ecclesia Christi was, or is, the ambivalence of the perfect tense in Latin, built, edificata est. Here one comes across the formula that is echoed on the walls of Santa Sabina. Tam ex circumcisione quam ex gentibus Christi Ecclesia prima qua eversa fuerat edificata est. The primeval church of Christ, the one that had been overthrown, is rebuilt or is built from both the circumcision and from the Gentiles. For Jerome, the rebuilding of the temple under Darius symbolizes the historical beginning of the Christian church. By establishing the church, Jewish and Gentile disciples have done something similar to the Jews under Darius. They have rebuilt the temple of God, a temple that had been left desolate not by the Babylonians this time, but by the Jews after their rejection of Christ. In addition, as this very compact passage indicates, Jerome also sees in this restoration of the Ecclesia Christi this eschatological plot that must unfold before the parousia takes place. We therefore have three series of events that fit into one another. First, the Jews rebuild the temple under Darius upon their return from exile, Haggai 1:1. In the apostolic time, Jews and Gentiles rebuild the church, damaged by the infidelity of the Jews. And third, together, Jews and Gentiles will reestablish the Church of Christ to her perfect state before the parousia takes place. In the light of Jerome's commentary, the iconographic program of the mosaics of Santa Sabina receives a fairly plausible explanation. As one would expect from a dedicatory inscription in which they are framed, this rationale has a very personal dimension. A number of scholars suggested that the ancestral background of Peter of Hilaria was Jewish, otherwise mentioning that he had, it's written here, been raised in the halls of Christianity from his childhood, as we read in the inscription, would hardly make sense, taking into account the fact that Jerome himself originated from Illyria, just as Peter did, illustrating the inscription on the walls of Santa Sabina by these mosaics was a way of saying somehow, see, you see how Jerome, the glory of my country, the authority of whom is recognized throughout the whole church, conceives the true Ecclesia Christi. This church stems from Gentiles, but also from Jews who accepted Jesus' Messiahship just like me, be it as a result of life circumstances. There is therefore no shame in being a priest coming from a Jewish background. In my opinion, this somewhat anecdotal conjecture conveys a fascinating theological message. Indeed, the passage from Jerome's commentary, to which the inscription implicitly refers, combines two of the additional meanings of the word restoration one finds in the Oxford Dictionary. First, there is this idea of the restoration of the temple, the mending of what has been damaged. And secondly, there is the idea of the end of time, the final restoration of all things that correlates with the notion of apokatastasis. Accordingly, looking at the mosaics of Santa Sabina, one can discern much more than a historical reference to a point in the past identified with the early beginning of the church. The mosaic points to the present. There are still people like Peter, people with a Jewish background joining the church, and these people are contributing to the edification of the house of God on a par with Gentiles. One could say that these people are repairing what has been damaged as a result of the Jewish dismissal of Jesus' Messiahship. They are filling the empty space that has upset the inner balance of the church. And finally, the mosaic points toward the end of times. A moment will come when the Ecclesia Christi will be reestablished in her perfect state, a state which coincides with the equal influx of Jews and Gentiles at the heart of her communion. So let me finish with a few considerations on the nature of this apokatastatic reestablishment. What I find interesting about the notion of apokatastasis is that it tells of a return to the origin that is quintessentially different from mere repetition. The end of history will be a return to the way it started. But if this return consisted of a mere reenactment of the beginning, history would lose the meaning that it acquired as a result of the Jewish Christian revelation. From this perspective, history cannot be the eternal return of the same as in the cosmic cycles theorized by Stoic philosophers. History is a process leading from point A to point B. The apokatastasis, marking the end of this process, does somehow lead back to the point where everything began, but in the mode of a radically new beginning. Pristiness, in its most authentic form, is not at the beginning of history, but at the end of it. It does not bring with it the simple erasure of sin, but it proclaims Christ's definitive victory over it. A formally defined, well-established Ecclesia, Circumcisione, never existed, even in the earliest apostolic times. Still, the apostolic church, with the community of James in Jerusalem and the priority given to the Jewish component of the universal church, foreshadowed an Ecclesia Circumcisione. For fear of going against her own decision to accept Gentiles on a par with Jews, the apostolic church could not bring herself to establish an exclusively Jewish entity in her midst. However, her teaching, as well as her history, talks about a universal church that, by virtue of the vibrant witness of the Jewish disciples of Christ, is through and through conscious of her roots in the ongoing life of Israel. The overall trajectory of the Catholic Church, as well as that of the Orthodox churches in the course of almost 2,000 years of history, displays a powerful, at times ruthless tendency to forget this original message stemming from the apostolic times. True, across the centuries, people such as Peter of Illyria tried in more or less explicit way to spur the church into remembering this message of old. They did what they could to fix the breaches that disfigured the temple of God, this prima ecclesia Christi, as Jerome would call her. Today, however, some 80 years after the Shoah and the establishment of the state of Israel, the church stands at the crossroads. In the apostolic time, the leadership of the church took up the gigantic task, the revolutionary mission of opening the legacy of Israel to the Gentile world. At the point in history where we find ourselves at the other end of this process. It is no longer for the Gentile world that an overwhelmingly Jewish church needs to make room. On the contrary, it is for segments of the Jewish world that an overwhelmingly Gentile church should provide a home. That is for those that Paul calls the remnant of Israel in his epistle to the Romans. The little but increasingly growing number of Jews that have come to confess Jesus as the true Messiah of Israel. In the apostolic times, the leadership of the church dismissed a distinction between Jews and Gentile disciples of Christ that would have been viewed as detrimental to the latter, thus damaging the communion of all the faithful in the one living body of Christ. Today, drawing the lessons from a history that since the time of the apostles has been nothing short of tragic and sinful, we understand that the perfect accomplishment of communion in the one living body of Christ requires a distinction without separation, a distinction in a love untainted by envy between Jewish and Gentile disciples of Christ. The Church of Christ that has turned into an overwhelmingly Gentile entity must find in herself the generosity to give back to Jewish disciples what they actually never enjoyed in the course of history, namely an established biosphere that will preserve the uniqueness of the nation of Israel in the midst of the universal church. This is what the restoration of the Ecclesia Circumcisione in its most authentic sense, that is, in its apokatastatic sense, is about, As Paul writes in his epistle to Romans, for if their rejection be the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Until then, we Jewish disciples of Yeshua will, with the help of our Gentile friends, continue our endeavor to restore the breaches of the temple, just as Peter of Illyria did in his own way with the dedicatory inscription on the walls of Santa Sabina. Thank you for listening.